So, hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of Unpacking Possibility. I'm your host, Traci Stein. As always, I'm so happy to be here with you. Today, we're going to talk about a fascinating topic with two experts, and that's the topic of hypnosis and mystical experiences. You know that if you've been listening to this podcast, those are two things very near and dear to my heart. So I can't wait to get into it. I want to welcome Dr. Cameron Alldredge and Chris Corlett. I'm going to do a brief bio for each of them, and then we'll have them tell you more about themselves and their work. So Dr. Cameron Alldredge is a licensed psychologist and associate research scientist in the Mind-Body Medicine Research Laboratory at Baylor University. So Cameron teaches graduate and undergraduate psychology classes and runs a private practice that focuses on clinical hypnosis and utilizing non-ordinary states of consciousness. So Dr. Alldredge has received multiple awards, including the American Psychological Association Division 30's recognition for groundbreaking early career contributions to the advancement of scientific hypnosis, and the Stanley Krippner Award from the Society for Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis. He's also published dozens of scientific articles on hypnosis, as well as a recent book, which I just ordered, and congratulations. And he has led countless workshops and trainings on hypnosis. My other guest, Chris Corlett, is a fourth-year graduate student at the Mind-Body Medicine Research Lab at Baylor University as well, under the mentorship of noted psychologist and researcher Dr. Gary Elkins. Chris has a varied background in everything from writing and psychology to knowledge about a variety of spiritual practices. Chris's research focuses on studying hypnosis and mystical experiences specifically. He serves on the executive committee of the American Psychological Association Division 30, the Society of Psychological Hypnosis, and he's a member of the Society for Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis. So without further ado, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Your bios were so great. We can almost just stop there, but there's so much for us to talk about. Really, as you know, but our audience doesn't, I first came across your work because I was taking continuing education in hypnosis, and I'm always looking for something that is really interesting and inspiring outside of the norm. And right away, I saw the topic and I was like, I need to learn more about this. Maybe you should tell me and our audience about your work in a little more detail.
Sure. Yeah, so we have shifted our focus, our research focus in the lab to include more topics that are related to this renaissance that we're seeing in the scientific literature, mostly thanks to the use of psychedelics and the psychedelic assisted therapy. But there's this increased interest in the more spiritual or mystical topics of this realm of therapy and research. So we're trying to ride that wave because we see hypnosis as being a really fantastic tool to accomplish very similar effects. And if we can look at those a little bit more closely and focus on them, and we can do that without the use of psychedelics, then I think that's pretty noteworthy. So that's the broad overview of what we're kind of working on, and we're happy to get into any specifics based on the questions that you have.
Chris, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I could add a little bit to that. So
even your own motivation for studying this too. I'm very curious about that for both of you personally.
Yeah, well, I've always just found that kind of thing fascinating. I had some psychedelic assisted experiences when I was in my college days, and just kind of been fascinated with that kind of thing ever since. I started getting into yoga and meditation, and decided to make a career transition, and went back to school, studied psychology, and now I'm here at the Mind-Body Medicine Research Lab at Baylor. And was just kind of lucky enough to have the opportunity to study mystical experiences in relation to hypnosis, because some work had been done by Stephen Lynn and his colleague Evans, where they had just sort of stumbled upon the fact that hypnosis could induce a mystical experience. And our mentor, Dr. Elkins, knew that I was interested in psychedelics and psychedelic adjacent topics, and he found those articles and he was like, why don't you work on this for your master's project? And so we kind of developed our own project for that. And then, next steps, we're kind of looking at where we can take that next.
Yeah, and I think for me, I'm personally very religious, very spiritual, and I see that studying mystical experiences is this area where there's this very nice blend between the spiritual and the scientific. So it's giving space for scientific inquiry into these more spiritual topics. And so that for me is really rewarding, and that's why I like this line of research.
It's so great. I want you to answer in a moment, or describe rather to people, just the nuts and bolts of what hypnosis is and what mystical experiences are. But I want to also just say, as you were talking, I was thinking, religious practice or practices and spiritual practices, everything from the very secular to the distinctly religious, to me, they are inherently hypnotic. So it's such a natural pairing. But maybe before we go too much further, maybe you could give your definition that you would give to your patients or your study participants, what hypnosis is, what a mystical experience is.
Yeah, happy to. So the American Psychological Association, they have a specific division, which is Division 30. And now, I guess it's a decade ago, in 2015, they came out with an official definition of hypnosis. We had a number of experts on a panel come together and create one unified definition. And so they define it as a state of consciousness involving a focus of attention and reduced peripheral awareness, characterized by an enhanced capacity to respond to suggestion. So if we break it down, there's really three main parts. There is focused attention, which really means that you're just absorbed in the experience that is unfolding in hypnosis. The second part is reduced peripheral awareness. So what's going on around you and, other things in your life are not very important to you in that moment. And then the last part is an increased or an enhanced capacity for response to suggestion. That's just anything that is like a positive suggestion that brings about a change in what you think, feel, or do. And so that capacity and that ability is enhanced and increased in hypnosis. So that's the general definition and kind of how we operate using hypnosis here in our laboratory. And then to answer your second question, more about mystical experiences. So a mystical experience, there's a few different ways to talk about it. Usually they're described as being profound, often life-changing encounters with what individuals perceive as being the divine or ultimate reality. There's often a sense of unity, transcendence of time and space, deeply felt positive mood. Oftentimes they're indescribable for people, so there's this quality of ineffability. And then there's also a lot of times where there seems to be this intuitive understanding of profound truths. So it's really a deep spiritual experience. There's kind of a synonymous term that we use often in our own writing, which is a peak spiritual experience. So that kind of gives you a better idea, because oftentimes this mystical word is new for people. They also confuse it with the word mythical, which is very much a different thing. So
Yes.
we try to try to help people figure out, okay, what is a mystical experience and what makes an experience mystical?
I think those were such great definitions. And I think it's going to help people grasp a lot more the rest of what you'll be talking about today. I wanted to ask you, I know you mentioned peak experiences and mystical experiences. What other types of mystical experiences do people describe to you outside of the laboratory? So other things that people might be able to relate to, saying, oh, I know that feeling because I had it in this situation. Are there common situations where people would say, and this prompted a mystical experience?
That's a good question. I don't know if I would describe mystical experiences as common. I think they're somewhat rare. Oftentimes, people have mystical experiences because they follow closely and diligently kind of a religious way of life. So often mystical experiences are kind of a side effect of following a spiritual way of life. They can happen spontaneously, especially if you're kind of experimenting with drugs or things like that, or you have like a, particularly profound experience in life, and that can kind of sort of lead you to contemplation and then maybe have a breakthrough that could result in a mystical experience. But there are common features of mystical experiences when one does have them. A lot of this work was done by a man named W.T. Stace. He wrote a book in 1960 called Mysticism and Philosophy, and this was one of the early attempts at sort of categorizing and describing mystical experiences. And there are two primary mystical experiences or types. One is referred to as an extrovertive mystical experience, and the other is referred to as an introvertive mystical experience. And the extrovertive type is when one feels a profound connection to all, I want to say life, but it's more than life as we generally think about it, but it's a profound connection to everything. It kind of allows people to see the connection between all things and how all things are very much made of the same material or life force or however you want to talk about it. But it involves this like extreme sense of unity with everything from the people you know and love to the people that you don't know, to plants and animals or rocks or, just truly everything. It's kind of hard to conceptualize with with a sober mind, but so that's sort of the extrovertive type. And then the introvertive type is known more, if you think of like, a guru meditating on a mountain kind of thing, and the sort of defining characteristic of the introvertive experience is that all mental constructs kind of fall away. So like everything that your mind is normally consumed with, be it your day-to-day life, the project that you're working on that you have to get done in 6 months or 12 months, to emotions or background thoughts. There's basically the mind just kind of like stops working, stops attaching itself to things, and it feels like an extreme sense of freedom. And how a lot of people describe it is as if it's the ground of all consciousness, all existence, and it's like a connection with that unitary consciousness. So those are there, and then there's a lot of shared characteristics between the two, but that's kind of the primary difference of the two main types of mystical experiences.
It was so helpful. And I realize I misspoke before because it's like, oh, it's not common. Absolutely. It's a rare experience. But as you were talking and as I was looking back at your presentation that you did in some of your slides, it made me think of times in my life that I would describe as a mystical experience. And I don't think these are as uncommon in terms of no one's had them as we're often led to think, because a lot of times people don't talk about them. There isn't a normal social context for talking about them a lot. And, one I'm thinking about when my grandfather passed away, this is like 35 or more years ago. And it was such an excruciating loss. It was kind of a traumatic-esque experience for us because it was so sudden. And I remember a year later, I had a very profound and vivid transpersonal experience of him. I would call it a visitation. But it like the physical world almost disappeared. And it was so profound. And it was a connection that is so much beyond what I've ever experienced with a living person. And it's a hard thing to describe. I was like, there was no boundary to the fact that we were connected. And it was very brief. And similarly, I don't know if this is going to sound surprising or not, but I was having acupuncture and acupressure for a pain condition many years ago. And the pain of the treatment was so intense that I had an out-of-body experience while I was having this person work on me. But again, there was no separation between me and someone I love and the larger kind of spiritual, whatever that is that connects us. Some people would call it God, some people would call it something else or simply divine, but it was remarkable. Now, these have not been everyday experiences for me, but I've had others, and I'm wondering if there are situations that catapult people into mystical experiences. I mean, what you're talking about is hypnosis, which is amazing.
Yeah, and we're actually publishing a paper in the next couple months, really answering that exact question of, we see this mystical realm as being kind of like a destination, and there are many different vehicles and paths that you can take that all go to that same destination. And so we've studied and looked at psychedelics as one, but then the one we're mainly interested in our lab is, as you mentioned, hypnosis. But then there are so many different religious rituals or meditation and so many different ways to go to the same destination, which it just kind of shows that the mystical realm exists independent of the vehicle used to take you there.
It's really amazing. During your study, for people who aren't as familiar with psilocybin, psychedelic compound derived from mushrooms, and it does induce mystical experiences like feelings of oneness, love, self-love, and quite a bit more. I'm blown away at the results you found in your study because they seemed much more pronounced than for psilocybin and more reliable. Is that what you found?
Yeah, so it was we had a pretty small sample size. So in the future, we're expanding that to be way bigger, which will give us some more accurate data points. But at least for the small preliminary study we did, when comparing it to low and high doses of psilocybin, in a lot of ways, you're exactly right. The effects that participants in our study reported were either at the same level or better than folks who were on psilocybin. And then our rate of people who qualified for what's called a complete mystical experience was about the same rate, if not a little bit higher than people who actually take psychedelic compounds. And I think that brings up an important point, which is taking a psychedelic in and of itself does not guarantee that your experience will be mystical in nature. And so there is a lot of importance, and the psychedelic literature does a good job of talking about the set and setting. So having a helpful and a proper mindset going into the experience within a context or an environment that's going to help bring that about. So kind of pulling from that, that's what we used to try to strengthen our study, which was using a lot of factors relating to set and setting to try to bring that mystical experience about.
So can you describe some of those set and setting factors that were really important in your study, and what you did to create those?
Yeah. We did a number of things. So another kind of influence on the study that we did was a paper called Tripping on Nothing, where the researchers gave participants a placebo pill, essentially, and they told them that it was psilocybin, and then they put them in an environment that sort of replicated what one might think of if they went to like a psychedelic party or something like that. So the lights were dim, there was kind of like ambient pulsing music in the background, there was a lot of art to look at, and they just kind of generally tried to create a vibe that would evoke what people associate with a psychedelic trip experience party. And they found that a number of the people thought that they were tripping simply on a placebo. So we wanted to lean into building that expectation in our participants. So we were very careful about creating the set and setting, preparing the participants for the experience. So when I would go out to greet our participants, I had like a white lab coat on to kind of set the tone, like this is scientific, and then give them, and this is partly for safety reasons also, I would give them a little talk beforehand about how these experiences can be very powerful. They can sometimes be life-changing, sometimes they can be scary, and again, just kind of building that anticipation in their minds and suggesting to them, that's sort of like a hypnotic technique, right? That they were going to have a powerful experience. And then we created a room where Cameron performed the induction, and we kind of outfitted it to make it look like a psychedelic therapy treatment room. So we had like a rock salt lamp and a tapestry on the wall and some art and like just some other kind of like non-specific religious paraphernalia type stuff. So we wanted to create a set and a setting where, number one, they felt safe, and number two, that they kind of expected that they were going to have such an experience. And also something that we did to kind of improve our chances at having that happen, we enrolled participants only if they were of medium to high hypnotizability. So that's part of the reason why our results were so high. Well, we don't know that. We still need to test it. But anyway, so we really wanted to set ourselves up for success in all those ways.
And your participants had such interesting responses. I jotted some things down, but one that really stuck with me during your presentation was one participant you described as having the sensation or the experience in the mind of hugging someone who had rejected them, and then realizing that they were in fact hugging themselves, but that they felt empty. And what they took from that is that they needed to love themselves more. So it was a very powerful message, and it sounds like it was healing on more than one level.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I remember too, there was one participant who by the end of the experience had soaked the eye mask because she was crying so much because of how powerful and profound the experience was for her. So yeah, a lot of really amazing things just from our, hour-long protocol that we just kind of made up thinking this sounds like it should work. And sure enough, it did.
It's really amazing. If I remember correctly, your participants noted increased feelings of peace. They noticed increased feelings of hopefulness and connectedness to humanity, decreased anxiety, and also the beautiful and loving experience of connecting with a deceased loved one. Right. And I want to just emphasize again that what you are talking about is using hypnosis, a clinical tool, but something that just about everyone has some aptitude for. And I'm saying that knowing that a certain percentage of the population are considered low to, not hypnotizable. But I don't know if I'm convinced that that means one cannot have some version of a hypnotic experience. I think just about everybody daydreams. I would consider that a hypnotic experience. So it's so powerful. Also, just as an aside, early in my development of this podcast, I interviewed a good friend, Tony Bossis, who was one of the principal investigators of the psilocybin study at NYU with people with life-threatening illnesses. And I'm bringing that up because, a lot of what you're talking about they did as well is making a very comfortable, safe setting, having therapists be very present and guide them through the process to shape it toward being on the more positive end, right? So they didn't have a bad trip. But people's lives from one session were so transformed, right? Their fear of death in a population of patients who knew they were likely to die within a certain period, their fears of death disappeared. Their feelings of connectedness and self-forgiveness and love and oneness were so profound. And I'm mentioning this because in your study, you found that your results were better with a non-drug, purely mind-body intervention. And that's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah. We were very happy and encouraged by the results. Didn't really know what to expect, frankly. Cameron wrote the script. She based it on the mystical experience questionnaire. It has 4 main subdomains of mystical phenomena: perception of space and time, ineffability, unity, and then he gave them suggestions based on all of that. So those are some of the main, components of a mystical experience. But really, we didn't really know what we were getting into, and our early results were not as good as the later results. So, I think maybe 3 of the first 4 participants or something like that did not have a mystical experience or a complete mystical experience. And then I think Cameron sort of caught his stride as the, hypnosis master. And, and what I was kind of most excited about personally was just what you're saying, relating to all the people's qualitative experiences as opposed to the quantitative self-report measures like the MEQ30, but what people said about their experiences after they were done, and some of these really profound experiences that people had, that one participant kind of realized that he was overextending himself in relationships and wasn't really giving himself the proper attention or care or love. We had another participant who felt as if she had communicated with an uncle that had passed away. And so she found some resolution to this really deep sense of grief. We had other people who had more extrovertive type experiences where they, felt profound senses of connection with everything and everyone. And when we started reading the qualitative reports, that's when I started to think that we might really have something here because, I myself was a little skeptical because I have taken psychedelics and I've been like, well, it must be the compounds that are doing this. But people are having mystical experiences without any substance at all. So I was really kind of floored by that. And, looking forward to the next, the next steps in the process.
I'm just out of curiosity, because I don't remember, were you able to follow up with participants from this study and see if they had subsequent mystical experiences? I know it was a small kind of pilot, so I understand if you didn't.
Yeah, for this study, we didn't do any kind of follow-up measurements or anything, but that is definitely what we're going to be doing in the next one.
It's so important. Cameron, I watched one of your videos. We could spend a whole interview just on that with your virtual reality analogy, but you mentioned something about, and I think this is so important, one key difference between using hypnosis to initiate any kind of experience, but a mystical experience specifically here, versus something like psilocybin or another psychedelic, is that you have much greater control over starting and stopping, and to some extent directing the experience when it's hypnosis.
Absolutely. That's honestly what I see as one of the biggest advantages, is that we don't need 8 hours and all these logistical things to be figured out. Instead, we can, within an hour, we have started and stopped the experience, and the person's able to drive home on their merry way without all the other things that come with having to take a psychedelic. So that's honestly one of the biggest advantages I see.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you, because a lot of people listening, just statistically, because most people don't go to therapy. A decent number do, but the majority of people don't. And then fewer people actually see someone who I think is qualified to actually, do clinical hypnosis with them. So for people who may not either have the opportunity or the resources or the inclination yet, I'm wondering if you two have thought about what people could do on their own to create more opportunity for that sense of connection, whether it reaches true peak experience or not. And I don't know if that falls under the realm of guided imagery, pre-recorded, or self-hypnosis techniques or something else. What do you suggest?
Yeah, I'll give an answer. And before I do, I'll kind of preface by saying that in our study, we were interested in this metric of complete mystical experience, which had certain criteria a participant would have to meet in their self-report in order to mathematically work out to be considered a complete mystical experience. And we had about 70% of our participants reach that. But the few who didn't, they still, were off the charts in how much they enjoyed it, and they had profound, powerful experiences. Even though in some areas they didn't quite get there to be what would be considered a complete mystical experience, it still tells us that they were able to have a pretty profound peak spiritual experience. So what I would say now to answer your question more directly is, I don't think there's anything special about the script that I wrote or me delivering the script or anything like that. I think we were very careful to create that set and setting, like we talked about, that allowed for this type of experience to be occasioned. But I think that can be experienced and brought about in so many different contexts. And so when if somebody's interested in having such an experience, I think it is something that is readily accessible to them if they go through the proper channels, but through the most effective ways to bring that about, which is going to be unplugging from life essentially for a minute, like putting things down, being able to clear your mind with intention of having that spiritual connection and that union with the divine, however that might be. So I think that's where religion comes in very well for a lot of people, is it can provide that scaffolding and that structure for people to have those types of experiences. So with somebody wanting to do it just on their own, they're going to be tasked with having to create that type of environment and mindset and ritual almost for themselves that's going to be effective in bringing that about. So there's so many different ways to do it, but just whatever works best for them, if they're trying to do it themselves, is going to be good. I'm sure there are audio recordings people have made. I don't know, maybe you're giving me ideas of
There
now.
are.
Yeah, I'm sure. But being able to maybe ourselves, after we've done some rounds of testing, be able to package up some nice way to deliver to people a reliable method to have their own mystical experience.
Yeah, I mean, I just didn't know if there was something when you were creating your hypnosis script that you were thinking, this is how I'm framing this, because this is, I feel like, what is the gateway? Because a lot of people have their feelings about imagery or wording that they feel like is that kind of doorway. And I know there's actually, like on Insight Timer and a lot of other places, a lot of people, imagery to meet a spiritual guide, or, and so forth. And I just find it so fascinating. And I don't know to what extent a lot of it is the actual wording or the energy of the person creating the recording, honestly, or the receptivity and intention of the participant, or what. I'm always just kind of curious.
Yeah, I think those are great questions. I don't know if you have anything too.
I mean, I think it's all of that, of course, people can achieve these kinds of experiences by accident, spontaneously, with very direct intention of having such an experience. And when that experience is facilitated by somebody else, we see this in psychotherapy all the time, like rapport between the therapist and the client is extremely important and may be responsible for a large part of positive therapeutic outcomes, is just having that connection with somebody. And so I think the same is probably very much the case when it comes to having a mystical experience that's guided by somebody else. If the rapport is there, if the person feels safe, if it's being delivered in a skillful manner, if the content of it resonates with the person who is receiving it, I think all of that is very important, and kind of goes along with the idea of set and setting. Like, that's always going to be a little bit different for every person. And so, if we can, what we're doing here is a little bit more, regimented. We want to, it's a scientific experiment, so it's going to be the same for every person, and we're trying to really narrow it down. But, if we're just talking generally, I think all that stuff is important, whether it be a person's individual motivation or their, connection with the person who's guiding them through that experience.
Well said. I don't know if this is too far afield for you guys. I mean, I have had a lifelong interest also in intuition, and I see that as often, not always, intertwined with the mystical. It doesn't have to be. And Cameron, I remember in your talk online, you referred just briefly to remote viewing and things like that, which I do. I'm curious about how many of your participants will wind up tapping into, this kind of timeless space, right? Where all things are possible, where time isn't really so linear. And I don't know if anybody reported anything like that during your study, or if any of your other clients have reported something like that.
Definitely. Actually, that is something that we've measured. Part of the MEQ30 is transcendence of time and space. And so a lot of people experience that. But I also think that that's just kind of a byproduct of hypnosis naturally, where a lot of times when we're doing hypnosis sessions with folks, they will report at the end of like an hour-long session, they'll be like, wow, felt like it was about 5 minutes long. Or it could be the opposite, where you do a short hypnosis session, they think it's 2 or 3 hours long, right? There's this fluctuation, this transcendence of time and space. And so I think that's inherent to these non-ordinary states of consciousness that we're dealing with. And that's how I see hypnosis as kind of just being one method to bring about a non-ordinary state of consciousness, kind of turning off our brain's natural conscious filter, changing that filtration system so that we can dive more into what is always there that we just kind of filter out, which is the more spiritual parts of ourselves and our psyche.
Yeah, so true. I want to ask you if there's anything that I did not ask you that I should have, or if there's anything else you would like to share about either your upcoming research or your ideas or other work or anything, or something you want to leave people with.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about the next steps we have for our research. So we're securing some grants and some funding. The big idea we have next is to do a large study with about 100 participants. Well, actually, it's going to be probably closer to about 130 participants going through really similar procedures as our pilot study. And before we go through our study with them and our experimental procedures, we're going to see where they're at as far as their spirituality, religiosity, and give them a bunch of measures of human flourishing. So we're mainly curious about how does one's spirituality and religiosity that they bring into the room with them at the beginning of the study, how does that affect the experience that they end up having? So then we'll give them the experimental procedures, and then after a 2-month period, a delay, we're going to give them those same measures of human flourishing, and we're going to ask them questions about the experience itself. And we're going to see, first of all, how is the experience augmented by what people bring with them? And then second, does it actually improve their life or bring about any beneficial change that lasts long term? I guess it's not long term, but at least 2 months, which is a pretty decent amount of time. So that's our next big project that we're gearing up for. I don't know, Chris, if you had other things you want to mention or parting words, but
no, I think that pretty much covers it.
This was, such a pleasure to hear you speak more about your work and your thoughts on these important topics. Again, I really meant it when I said we could spend quite a lot more time, talking about this, because there's so much there. But it's so compelling and so important. I really appreciate you both taking time out of your super busy schedules, because I knew it was a big ask to have you do that. Do you have websites or anything that you want people to check out? And if not, that's okay.
yeah, definitely. It's fresh on my mind because an initiative we're trying to do, I've noticed this gap in social media content of hypnosis being presented by clinicians or people properly trained and licensed. And so we are doing a big social media push. It's going to have a lot of highlights about our studies, about mystical experiences and all kind of things that our lab is doing. And so those social media handles, both on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, if it's still around, we'll see. And there, it's just my name, Cameron Alldredge, just one word, and that's where you'll find us.
Great. And I'll put that in the show notes. Cameron and Chris, I just want to thank you again for coming on the podcast. It's so great to hear from you and hear more about your work and all you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
My pleasure. This has been another episode of Unpacking Possibility. If you enjoyed the show, and I know you did, please remember to like, share, follow, leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. And as always, until next time, be well.